Welcome everyone to the second session in our British Academy funded seminar series on using mass observations COVID-19 collections. My name is Nick Clarke. I'm going to be chairing today. My co-organiser Clive was going to be chairing, and Clive, do you just want to briefly switch on your mic, say hello so everyone can see you?
Yes, hello. I was going to be chairing, but I'm not for circumstances, which I won't explain.
So hopefully Clive will chair the next one and you'll get to listen to a different voice then. The other two co-organisers are also on the call, Jessica Scantlebury and Kirsty Patrick, the two of the archivists at Mass Observation. Do you just want to wave and say hi to everyone?
Hello everyone.
Hiya, welcome.
Thanks. So in the last session a month or so ago, we focused on introducing mass observations COVID-19 collections and also thinking a bit about some of the existing literature on how to interpret writing in the mass observation archive. And there's a video of that session now up on Mass Observation's YouTube channel for any of you that are interested. Later in the series, we're going to be hearing from people who are using the COVID-19 collections or doing similar kinds of research, seeking to know everyday life through the during the pandemic, using similar kinds of materials like diaries, other forms of writing, or projects using other qualitative methods. But in today's session, we're very pleased to have two speakers whose research has been influential in how many of us approach and understand mass observation as a research organisation and an archive. And that's Ben Highmore and Nick Hubble. They're going to speak about their recent and current work on mass observation and hopefully help us to situate the COVID-19 collections at the archive in broader histories and interpretations of mass observation and mass observation materials. I'm going to hand over to Ben in a moment, but let me just remind everyone a little bit of the format for these sessions. Because we've got two speakers today, we'll ask Ben and Nick to speak each for approximately 30 minutes. We'll record the talks and stick them on Mass Observation's YouTube channel afterwards. During the talks, if everyone else could please turn mics and cameras off. But if you open the chat function, please do feel free to write comments for each other in the chat. That's one of the good ways that we've been learning from each other during these sessions. You can also write speakers, questions for the speakers in the chat as well. And if you begin your comment with question for Ben or question for Nick or question for both, then I can identify those comments as questions and read them out afterwards for the speakers to answer. We've got 2 hours. Whether we need the full 2 hours, we'll see, but hopefully there'll be plenty of opportunity in the second hour to open up things for a bit of Q&A, but also just general discussion. And at that point, we might be able to use the raise hands function as well and give people an opportunity to turn on their cameras and mics. So let's see how that goes. Ben, are you okay for me to hand over to you at this point?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, fine.
Okay. Okay, right. So I'm not really going to be talking about the COVID collection. What I'm going to try and do is situate mass observation historically, but also to, I think, end up with some kind of ethical questions about how we treat mass observation material. What do we do with it? First of all, just a little bit of background about my relationship to mass observation. I think I certainly had heard about mass observation before I ever did any work on mass observation, and I think one of the framings of that was that I was hugely suspicious of mass observation, partly because several of the critiques that were kind of circulating in the late 80s early 1990s were just, kind of quite devastating. So one of them was that mass observation was this kind of naive positivism that could simply kind of understand the world by just going out there and kind of asking people. But the other critiques were much more sophisticated in some ways, and were concerned that what was actually a kind of colonial form of anthropology, going and studying the natives, was being done under the auspices of mass observation. Partly this connected to, I think, what was quite a kind of public form of mass observation, which were the photographs of Humphrey Spender, which were being kind of shown quite a lot, and kind of quite a bit of interest in that. But it was also about the difference between the kind of anthropological Tom Harrison side of mass observation and the diary, the kind of mass observers as kind of diarists. And this was a kind of class critique where the kind of working class, the northern proletariat, were there as objects of analysis. They were there to be studied by these professional mass observers, whereas the people who wrote for mass observation tended to be what mass observation themselves call middle class or lower middle class. So there was this idea that the kind of the working class were kind of objects of mass observation, whereas the middle and lower middle class were the subjects of mass observation. So that was kind of how I was kind of looking at it first of all. But actually what I found was something much weirder than that. So my first connection with mass observation was not through the archive itself, but was through stacks of microfiches, if people remember them. Bristol University Library had a kind of set of mass observation microfiches. And the first thing I did was I kind of worked through, I can't remember how many, maybe 100 nightmares. People had recorded their nightmares during the so-called phony war at the beginning of the Second World War. And I was kind of reading these, one nightmare after another as my skin began to prickle. And I was kind of really struck by the idea that a group of people in the late 1930s might think that people recording nightmares was a kind of evidential, a work of kind of evidence. This was because I've been led, I think, to think of this as this was some sort of kind of positivistic sociology, rather than something that was actually much more attentive to a whole range of kind of ethics, I think, of making people involved, participants in a project. Since then, I've written about mass observation, both as kind of, I guess, thinking about it in terms of kind of intellectual history, but also, for instance, I wrote a chapter based entirely about one person's response to a 1983 directive on housework. And this is a thing where I think some interesting kind of debates come across. I mean, mass observation, the very word mass, suggests quantities of words, quantities of responses, a world in which kind of quantities kind of mattered. And yet you can, as you kind of work through these archives, it's quite often the singularity of one response, of one kind of way of kind of answering a directive that can really speak and really kind of have some kind of evidence attached to it. I mean, it was a kind of extraordinary response to the directive. It was a 50-page typewritten account of a woman who tries to really understand her habits and routines around housework. So what she does is does a kind of time and motion study. Well, she starts off just by simply kind of diarising what she does feeding the kids, doing housework. And then the second week she decides that's not good enough. I'm going to use a stopwatch, and I'm going to do this much more thoroughly. And it's also very funny. She ends up having a kind of meeting, getting a whole meeting together with the family, a house meeting, and kind of redistributing labour across everyone in the house. So it kind of fits into what I want to suggest, that one of the things that mass observation does, which is that I want to understand it partly as a type of consciousness raising. And I think this is a term that whereas mass observation don't use the term consciousness raising, they do talk about kind of altering consciousness, that mass observation is designed to alter consciousness. And it's that I'm going to be partly looking at today. So anyway, I sent something round. It was a chapter that I've just written because Bloomsbury are republishing the very first mass observation pamphlet. So I was writing about that. I was kind of writing about just that very kind of inaugural moment, I guess, between November 1936, where the kind of mass observation group starts conforming, and then January, where they get together with Tom Harrison, and then this pamphlet comes out soon after. And it's a kind of recruiting pamphlet, as so many of those very early pieces were. They're kind of suggesting, come and join this project, join the project. Before I get started on that, I did want to note in the pamphlet, there's this kind of section towards the end where they're kind of going through their kind of methods and their processes, very much indebted to anthropology. They're following a lot of the information they're getting from kind of anthropological work to understand what it was they're going to be looking at. But they also put together a kind of list. It's a list that actually, if you kind of read it right from the beginning, is incredibly prescient about the kinds of things that we would be interested now, I think, at this moment, at this stage in the pandemic. So this is the list, and I'm taking it very straight from the top, if you like. This is the list in the order that it was sent. So this is what mass observation say. Finally, here is a mixed list of possible topics of inquiry sent in by many different observers. Reactions for and against vaccination, anti-Semitism, funerals and undertaking, behaviour at war memorials, sophistication and class, flu epidemics. So this sense of illness, health, as being at kind of the centre of mass observation is there, I think, kind of right from the beginning, and should be a kind of point of continuity, I think, between the 1937 project and what people might want to do now with this Covid-19 collection. Okay, as I was kind of working through the pamphlet, several kind of terms really kind of jump out at the reader. And I think the two that really kind of struck me as kind of being interesting and kind of conflictual were that the kind of endless insistence on science. This is going to be a scientific project. At the same time as they're also insisting that this scientific project will produce a collective poem. And this together, this kind of collective poetry and science is something that I think gets to the kind of contradictory heart of mass observation, as it was in these kind of early years. Incidentally, Charles Madge, who was one of the founders of mass observation, came to mass observation as a very successful poet, and he kind of by 1950, he was the first professor of sociology at Birmingham University. This without actually completing an undergraduate degree. Can you imagine? So this sense of kind of science and poetry together kind of immediately make you want to ask, okay, well, what do they mean by science? What does the word science do? And also, what kind of poetry might be involved here? Part of the pamphlet is addressed to what they call superstition. So they're trying to understand superstition. Superstition for them is kind of hugely important at this moment, partly because they see it kind of all around them. They see superstition going on in Germany with the Nazis, what they call Nazism, they also name as racial superstition. But they also want science because they don't want to be not science. And I think for them, kind of not science was kind of a pure individualism, expressivity, just for its own sake. They didn't want to be seen as a kind of literary project. So science was also a way of saying, we're doing this collectively. This is a collective project. It's a way of kind of working where you're kind of not working in your own interests, but you're working with the kind of interests of a kind of a bigger collective. And also, science is a term that they kind of desperately want to kind of hang on to, because it's a way of kind of making judgments, connecting with other projects, all kinds of things like that. But I think one of the tensions that come up then is how they kind of relate science to superstition. So they're seeing superstition both in kind of everyday life. There's some of the kind of big events that happened around them was the abdication, and they see a kind of superstitious response to that partly. But they're also not treating science in opposition to superstition. This, I think, is kind of an interesting, or a kind of another kind of interesting tension. They're not saying, okay, well, we're a scientific project, and this scientific project is going to absolutely rid you of your superstitions. You'll be able to leave this project as a kind of purely deliberative, rational person. So their idea of science is that superstition exists as a social fact. What to do with it is to kind of understand it. Science is also a way of not wanting to be thought of as a kind of political project. It was a way of, I think, kind of suggesting, okay, well, we're not here as a kind of chapter of the Labour Party or the Liberal Party. Science for us gives us a way of looking at the project outside of those positions. Again, this is kind of puts it on the angle of being a project more interested in description than prescription. They're not out there to convince people of particular things. Okay, I think one of the things that came up last time we met was, what kind of writing was this? What kind of work was it that mass observers were doing? And I think it was this that I got particularly interested in this pamphlet. One of the things that the pamphlet sets up is there being a kind of difference between what they call their official observers, or the paid observers, I guess, and the mass observers, the people who respond to directives. But this isn't quite true. There isn't this kind of strict demarcation in terms of amateur and professional, or trained and untrained. because one of the things that mass observation sets up is that joining mass observation, becoming a mass observer, is itself a form of training. And they talk in quite kind of detail about how that training is going to be undertaken. It's it's kind of informal. It's kind of exercises in first, describing yourself, describing images. So it's kind of an invitation to elaborate, to use your kind of powers of description as much as your powers of observation. But I think one of the things that this doesn't capture is the way that mass observation untrained its observers. And one of the kind of massive untrainings it had to do was to get over people's sense that their world was not interesting, to untrain them out of that mode of perception that would see routines, housework, daily life as unworthy of commentary, unworthy of description. So that was a kind of massive form of untraining, I think. And it's this that is the kind of encouragement and invitation. And you see this kind of reflected in commentary in first year's work, which is the next, the third publication they come out with after the May the 12th book, where people say, actually, this has transformed the way I spend Sundays, because I reflect on it in a different way. Things matter in a different way. And this, again, I think is part of what I'm calling, with a nod to 70s feminism, consciousness raising, that it's actually altering people's consciousness of the world around them. In the essay that I wrote about the pamphlet, one of the things I really wanted to kind of pick up on was to try and understand what mass observation, where they were kind of coming from, kind of intellectually. And I took from the first year work project this sense of coming out of kind of David Hume's empiricism. And David Hume is a kind of interesting figure in philosophy because he really starts what might be called a kind of radical empiricism. He has these kind of incredible moments where he says, of course, my understanding of the world is completely different if I'm really happy from when I'm really sad. But this doesn't make me unable to describe the world or to invalidate what I'm saying about the world. In fact, quite the opposite. It's because I'm this sensitive person, because the world changes as I change in my relationships, that allow me to have some kind of understanding of the world. So that's detailed if you're interested in more detail in the essay that I sent. I haven't got much longer, so what I want to focus on is this moment it's both in the pamphlet, but it's also in another essay by Charles Madge on poetics, mass observation kind of poetics, and it's where they're looking at a particular example of a kind of mass observation response. So the observers have been asked to come up with examples of behaviour of superiors to subordinates and vice versa. And one of the observers, a woman who has sent in 36 accounts of this, and they've kind of taken one of them, which I'm going to read now. Coming home on a Midland red bus from Birmingham, a distance of approximately 6 miles, I was sitting on the front seat near the large sliding door. There was a cold easterly wind blowing in my eyes. I touched the conductor on the sleeve to attract his attention and said, "May we have the door closed, conductor?" He turned round and leant towards me in a confidential way and then said, in a most insolent manner, Yes, when I'm ready to shut it. I was too surprised to make any reply. The door remained open until I left the bus. Now, my guess is what mass observation were interested in, what Madge and Harrison and other people, Jennings, were kind of interested in here, was that this has a kind of huge kind of economy of affect. But what it describes is a kind of orchestration of emotions and affect done with incredible kind of economy, really kind of succinct. We really understand that the shock of someone kind of coming towards you in quite a kind of informal, kind of friendly manner, leaning in, and then returning what was a question, what was kind of asking, a request to say, in my own time, I'll do it in my own time, this kind of disdain. Now, of course, we don't know whether this is true or not. We don't know whether she's kind of misunderstood or he's would give a very different account of it. This is entirely part of the kind of mass observation project. We're not in search of some absolute kind of guide of truth. What we're interested in is the feelings of subordination, of kind of moments of what it feels like to have someone be disdainful towards you, what it feels like to maybe, in a sense, we also get secondhand a sense of what it might be like to be a bus conductor, to have those kind of questions made of you, to be seen to be a subservient being. It's this sense of feeling then that I think is kind of crucially important, and it's this that you kind of get from mass observation. So kind of questions around, how trustworthy are the accounts, or what kind of evidence that do they give, can't start out from an idea, a kind of kind of pure objectivity. What we have is a more kind of sociological idea of these as social facts because they're felt, because this is one person's experience at one time from one angle. And what we get with mass observation, what we get with the quantity of this material is not some sort of kind of representational, statistical world that we can then take to policymakers and say, okay, well, based on these surveys, 64% of the world think this or think that. They're not interested in those opinions per se. What mass observation is this incredible mosaic, kind of cubist collage of things seen from all different angles. In some ways, this isn't history from below. It's history from above, from the side, from underneath, from all sorts of angles imaginable that we get. So in just kind of finishing now, I just want to kind of suggest that there may be kind of two questions that we have and that we might take towards the COVID-19 material, which is, what do we do with the mass observation materials? How do we write it? And I think this is for me was always a kind of key, the key difference between something like the May the 12th book, which is a kind of massive collage of people's words, and the more and the kind of attempts in Bolton to try and distill from that some certain kind of ideas about how society worked. So it's a real question of what kind of evidence is this, and what does it kind of ask us to do with it? For me, it's really a question of, is this material there to be interpreted, or is it already an interpretation? And this, for me, is kind of an ethics question. If mass observation really was an invitation, and still is an invitation, to a co-creative, participatory project, then, you know, there's a sense of obligation there. There's a sense of that we need to take people at their word, that actually it's the word, it's the poetics of these accounts, these testimonies that need to count for something. We can't simply, you know, extract meanings from these words with other words. We need those words, in a sense, to speak for themselves, as Dorothy Sharon's volume was titled. So I'm kind of leaving you with that question of kind of an obligation. We have a kind of obligation to the poetics, I think, of the mass observation responses. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ben. That's great. Huge amounts to think about there, and especially that last point about the ethics of how we engage with and use these materials is really important for us to think about. Nick, okay, if we move straight on to you, and then we'll come back for questions and discussion at the end.
Yeah, that's great. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully this will work. And then can I start that? So I can't actually get to the is it all right if I just, oh no, it'd probably be better if I showed it in full screen, wouldn't it?
If you go right to the bottom, can you see the last icon on the right at the bottom?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, the just to the left of the minus sign.
That's the one. Right. Okay. Cheers. Yeah, I was never done it that way before. Okay. So self-reflexive writing, everyday life and social change in mass observation narratives. So what can mass observation tell us about how people adapt to social change in the 21st century? Well, I've just been doing, well, I am doing a British Academy project, Understanding Social Change through Autobiographical Narrative. How do the diaries and memoirs of ordinary British people reflect periods of intense social change? This project will explore the role of narrative self-reflexivity in helping people understand and adapt, sometimes retrospectively, to two key periods of change, 1939 to 43 and 1981 to 4, through research into the Mass Observation Archive and the Barnett Archive for Working Class Autobiographies held at Brunel University, London. As I will be discussing, these periods mark paradigm shifts in British history. The Second World War saw an abrupt change between modes of democracy, as Ross McKibben notes. In the 1930s, the ruling definitions of democracy was individualist and its proponents chiefly a modernised middle class. In the 40s, the ruling definition was social democratic and its proponents chiefly the organised working class. Whereas the early years of the Thatcher government saw what Andy Beckett has described as a revolution in the head, establishing Thatcherism as a national story, but also breaking with traditional deference. Note that both periods coincide with mass observation activity. The original 1937 to 49 project not only recorded, but arguably contributed to the shift from interwar individualism to the post-war social democracy of the welfare state. The contemporary mass observation project, founded in 1981, has recorded the experience of neoliberal deindustrialized Britain, in which the memory of the three post-war decades and their values remain strong, but at odds with the overriding economic imperatives of the 40 years it now covers. I'm not arguing that the contemporary mass observation project has contributed to this second shift, but I think it illustrates some of the ways in which that shift functions, as I will go on to discuss. Okay, so this British Academy project was conceived before the COVID-19 pandemic, but with the supposition that we are currently experiencing a 21st century paradigm shift in which new social cultural values and structures of feeling are emerging. The major example being changes around Brexit. To be comparable with these two earlier historical paradigm shifts would require there to be a major transformation in the way the British state is organised politically and economically. Arguably, this is happening. For example, in last weekend's Sunday Times, in a somewhat breathless article on how the Tories weaponise woke, Tim Shipman quotes an anonymous informant on the current opportunity to realign Brexit politics. Westminster likes to bracket people as left and right, they said, but the real gap in the political market that Boris Johnson identified and has successfully filled is people who lean left on spending and public services but are culturally conservative. Obviously, we're hearing about this all the time. It's not necessary to agree with the political line of the Sunday Times to accept that something is happening here. You might not trust them on their description of what it actually is. The idea of a return to a corporate state, which has evolved in response to the EU referendum of June 2016 and the supposed causes and drivers of the Leave vote, has become real during the COVID pandemic, which has seen billions of pounds of public expenditure, including unprecedented levels of social spending, such as on the furlough scheme. In this respect, the COVID pandemic is not an isolated, relatively unprecedented natural emergency, but a phenomenon that has been shaped by a pre-existing emergent form of politics. What has happened is a complete reversal of not just the austerity politics of 10 years ago, but also the politics of the Brown, Blair, Major and Thatcher administrations. As an undergraduate, I remember a lecturer who repeatedly talked about a woman in Norwich who, inverted quotes, went mad when Charles I was executed, as an example of how powerful and destructive social change can be. Her understanding of how the world worked was destroyed, and so nothing made sense anymore. There's a lot of talk in the media about the mental health effects of the isolation and lockdown resulting from the pandemic, as well as the anxiety generated by fear of the virus. But I suspect some of this is also due to the ongoing paradigmatic change. There's a struggle to ensure that our stories of ourselves continue to make sense, and I don't think the real brunt of this has yet been felt. This is where self-reflexive writing, whether diaries or writing for MO or similar projects, is important. My project was concerned with the propensity of self-reflexive writing to help people to adapt to social change, not just in terms of making sense of that change, but also in terms of actively shaping that change by developing new understandings and values. The point is to show the kinds of ways this happened during the original mass observation project of the 1930s and 1940s, and also during the revived project of the 1980s and afterwards. And alongside that, I'm not just looking at mass observation, but also the Bruno archive of working class autobiographies. There is indeed a picture of me in it, working on areas such as working class autobiography and proletarian autobiographic fiction, because in the 30s there was also a shift. You suddenly got many more working class people involved in writing and producing autobiography and other forms of fiction, as discussed by the historian Christopher Hilliard. And you also got the appearance of proletarian autobiographic fiction, which is kind of, rather than writing working class autobiography, people kind of fictionalized their life story and wrote about it in that way. And this produces a kind of different effect. So somebody like D.H. Lawrence, for example, and there's a whole succession of kind of mining novelists who write in that vein. You also get kind of feminist examples. Ethel Manning, who's the son of a daughter of a post office letter sorter, writing these kind of completely flashy, provocative, and intoxicating kind of made up fictions of her own kind of success, which form a more complete and illuminative record of my mental evolution than any diary could have conveyed. These changes are all happening in the kind of 1930s, and I think they kind of feed into what is happening with mass observation. Some of these people actually wrote for mass observation. For example, Walter Allen, one of the Birmingham group of writers, was writing kind of proletarian autobiographic fiction in the late 30s, and also writing, as you know, for mass observation. as a kind of panelist. And another example, as I'm going to come to in a minute, is Naomi Mitchison, not working class, from a very upper class family, but was also writing for mass observation for reasons I'm going to get to in a second. At which point, though, I want to say that the project that I was doing for the British Academy included a commitment on the behalf of the researcher to be equally self-reflexive concerning their own practice. Therefore, I'm going to break the academic equivalent of the fourth wall and reveal that the pandemic has quite significantly affected my project. I was expecting to do much of the archival research in the spring and summer of 2020 before completing by the end of September 2020. In the event, however, it was impossible to travel, and in any case, I wasn't in the best state to carry out research. Like many people, I was affected by the pandemic. I felt anxiety, had some difficulty sleeping, had occasional bouts of ill health, which felt like having a virus, but given the lockdown and social distancing, where was this virus coming from? When was I catching it? Therefore, by the time September arrived, I'd made no progress, and so I applied for the maximum 12-month extension for the grant, and this came through just as I started feeling really ill. I was diagnosed, first over the phone, but eventually in person, as suffering from post-viral syndrome as a result of having a virus in March, which was probably maybe, but not necessarily COVID. At the time, I didn't think it was because I didn't have the right symptoms and I didn't seem to be ill enough. But last autumn, I ended up being off work for 3.5 months before making a phased return in mid-January this year. And since then, until a couple of weeks ago, I've just been trying to get through the rest of the academic year. So on the one hand, my project still hasn't got much further, and I've got just over 3 months left to get on top of the formal outputs. On the other hand, though, I've made a lot of progress with the self-reflexive element because I've spent 15 months keeping a diary throughout the COVID pandemic period, which at times was the only thing I was capable of writing. And in the process, I've learned quite a lot about how self-reflexive writing works for the person who is keeping the diary, rather than the person who is writing about the person who is keeping the diary. Obviously, I already understood from an academic perspective that lives live with the knowledge that what happens will soon be written about, becomes shaped by the stories their writers wish to tell. In other words, the attraction of mass observation to people who aren't otherwise writers is that it gives them a chance to become the authors of their own lives in a way that hadn't been open to them before. Conversely, over the years, it has enabled some well-known writers, for example, Naomi Mitchison, to write themselves as ordinary people. While being an academic is hardly so prominent a position as Mitchison occupied in the 1930s, there are several reasons why it seems to preclude us from having authentic public views. One of these reasons is that the notional goal of objectivity and the related idea that academics should write analytically in a non-partisan and impersonal manner. Another is that within universities themselves, much more value is now put on engaging with public audiences and having an impact on policy than engaging with or having an impact on academic audiences. In some ways, we now don't institutionally value ourselves. Furthermore, in post-Brexit Britain, academics are now portrayed as part of an unrepresentative metropolitan elite whose liberal values are simultaneously both an affectation and an expression of a particular professional bubble. I mean, my point's not to complain, but to explain the attraction I felt to writing a diary as just another person on the street. And one consequence of the COVID pandemic, despite the role social inequality has played in its impact, has been to make many people aware of their own mortality, their own fragility as human bodies susceptible to contracting a potentially deadly infection from other human bodies. There's been a shift of perspective as vulnerability has enabled a new kind of sensibility and self-understanding for those who have reflected on their own experiences. This doesn't just apply to people who have kept diaries or written about themselves in some other way, but I think it's possibly felt most acutely in those groups. Therefore, this kind of provisional conclusion, one value of the MO COVID collections is that they give us a window onto the opening up of subjectivity. I mean, arguably all mass observation writing does that, but I think you might expect a bigger shift of subjectivity during the last 18 months through these COVID collections. We should be able to see that, what we actually do with it, as Ben was just asking. is a different question. I don't think we can yet see, where this process is leading us, perhaps a shift in kind of consciousness in response to the pandemic. That's something that will emerge through more analysis and over time, because these processes are still unfolding. But we can look back and see how similar processes played out in World War II. So, for example, in the diaries that were kept by mass observation over World War II, for example, the most famous of which is Nella Last, who's was one of 400 wartime diaries. I think about 100 of them made it to the end of the war. Nella Last kept on going, submitting her diary monthly into the late 1960s. Naomi Mitchison was another one whose diary lasted throughout the duration of the war and has been published as Among You Taking Notes. In his book about the wartime diaries, James Hinton argues that mass observation offered a discipline and a context which transcended the purely private, meeting a need to frame individual quests in relation to public purposes. And I think this is kind of still one of the key elements of mass observation writing. It's being written as an individual diary, but with the expectation that somebody will read it, possibly a future historian, as was discussed in the last session. And I'm hoping Claire raised the issue of will there be any future historians, but I'm still optimistic that there might be some point in the future to read these diaries. Diaries, Hinton goes on to suggest, take us as close as a historian can hope to get to observe selfhood under construction, and in particular reveal to us the everyday unfolding of what, following the work of Charles Taylor, he takes as a central process of modernity, the radical disembedding of individual subjectivity from received sources of meaning, which is another way of saying, it kind of freed people to free them from the kind of narratives, externally imposed narratives that were controlling their lives, to kind of make sense of their own lives and therefore act differently. So thus, if we return to the example of Miriam Green, who's one of my favorite diarists, not one of the diarists that Hinton analyzes. She is in Dorothy Sheridan's Wartime Women book. Miriam Green, we see a young woman of 18 at the outbreak of the war, writing about everyday activities in the village she lives in, which would all be perfectly ordinary, apart from her strong understanding that she was part of an extraordinary collective practice that everyone ought to have heard of. And I'm probably not going to read out the entirety of these quotes, but hopefully you can access them when the recording goes up. But going with a sister who was also writing for mass observation to try and find copies of War Begins at Home, to look at the lines they put in it, 14 lines that she had and 25 lines for her sister. And I just always love that quote, because of, the kind of sheer excitement of seeing yourself in print. The sense of belonging to mass observation repeatedly occurs in Muriel Green's diary, culminating in her account of an impulsive trip to the organisation's London office, where she meets Tom Harrison at the door. Harrison, despite being too busy to stop and talk for more than a few moments, comes across as polite and friendly. And then she said, I came away and for the next half an hour could do nothing but laugh about it to myself. I wondered what Tom Harrison really thought and how he probably was cursing inwardly all the time he was being nice and polite. I expect he was terribly annoyed, but I was triumphant that I'd actually been and not quite got kicked out. He also thanked me so much for doing the MO directives, etc. I thought him very charming and did not mind at all being got rid of, as I expected it. I was very glad I went. However, he and MO in general would be about it. So it's this kind of, again, this idea of participating in the project. I mean, obviously, I'm not sure that the keep would appreciate it if everybody who contributed just turned up on the doorstep and wanted a half-an-hour chat. But there's a sense there that there's some sort of kind of overarching kind of purpose involved. But what I also like about that passage, actually, I'll just go back to that one for a second, the diarist's ability to generate not only her own unspoken thoughts, but also those of Harrison, you know, kind of creates a kind of equivalence between the two of them that's amplified by the fact that the description of the encounter is then fed back to mass observation, and Harrison, by being submitted as part of her monthly instalment, you know, the potentially endless reflexivity of this process captures the logic of mass observation, that if everyone were a mass observer, then the observation of another would always be in some way an observation of oneself. And so therefore the divisive boundaries between people, between classes, between genders would dissolve. It's this inherent logic that makes a mass observation diary, at least potentially, collectively self-reflexive in a way that possibly exceeds the self-reflexivity of a normal diary. You know, this self-reflexivity beyond self-reflexivity affects the way that we need to read these diaries. Muriel, on a brief trip home from her war job as a gardener in the southwest, realizes that she can never go back to her life as a garage girl amidst the vibrant pre-war modernity, what George Orwell described as the rather restless cultureless life centering around tin food, picture posts, the radio, and the internal combustion engine. She does not just recognize the loss entailed in growing up, or that caused by the war, but both of these things combined with an implicit recognition that the self-reflective act of writing a diary as part of a collective enterprise is irrevocably distancing herself from her younger, less reflective self. And therefore you get her crying bitterly about buying back, not because of the war, but, you know, it's kind of nothing can ever be the same again. It's a kind of moment of recognition. And what that highlights is how fundamentally the process of disembedding oneself from the past in order to move into the future is part of everyday life. I mean, we all have those moments. You don't necessarily have to live through the Second World War or COVID pandemic. It was the particular form of self-reflexivity generated by the practice of writing about themselves for mass observation that allowed the diarists to realize that they were agents of history, which is to say that they became aware of themselves making history through the process of going about their everyday lives, and therefore gave them the confidence to pronounce on public matters with an authority they would not otherwise have had in a hierarchical society. So you see that in the next quote, which is Muriel Green's reflections on the 1945 general election. You know, I feel that at last the working classes of this country have begun to think for themselves and wake up. You know, they do not want to go back to 1939. A better world is going to be the result of this election, and that the future, in spite of so many difficulties, is bright. It is for the young people of this country to support the new government to success. A kind of statement I don't think she would have been able to make at the beginning of the war. It's kind of part of the process of the change over that period, but also part of the process of her self-reflexive diary writing for mass observation. What Muriel Green's diary shows is how one person adapted to change through self-reflexive writing and not only came to espouse new values, but contributed to their generation as one amongst millions. Collectively, that story was part of the People's War paradigm, to use the title of Angus Calder's 1969 book. And mass observation was initially seen as a fundamental part of that paradigm and the road to 1945, i.e. to the establishment of the welfare state, to use the title of Paul Addison's 1975 book. Both Addison and Calder being PhD students at Sussex and part of the story of how the mouldering MO papers were transformed into an archive. However, by the 1990s, Calder had revised his earlier, more utopian view of history in The Myth of the Blitz, written in hindsight, gained from the bitter experience of the Thatcherite deployment of the war in an early deployment of the Make Britain Great Again strategy, which underwrote the aggressive economic reforms of the 1980s. So as just as well, Ben said that mass observation is not history from below, because I get onto Thatcherite history from below here. And Stuart Hall's analysis that Thatcherism was a form of nostalgia for the bygone proletarian style of life displayed by those who were moving out of the working class. What Thatcherism as an ideology does is to address the fears, the anxieties, the lost identities of a people. It invites us to think about politics in images. It is addressed to our collective fantasies, to Britain as an imagined community, to the social imaginary. As Raphael Samuel concurs, part of the allure of Factorism was it offered those unsettled by the social changes of the 1960s, such as women's liberation, the decriminalisation of homosexuality, the abolition of the death penalty, and anti-racial discrimination policies that enshrined the multicultural nature of London and the other big cities. It offered these people a Thatcherite version of history from below, which gave pride of place to those who she called ordinary people. As Hall discusses, rather than contest such a construction of the working class, the Labour Party reinforced it during the 1987 election by proclaiming its desire to appeal to the traditional Labour voter and presenting the party's leader, Neil Kinnock, as a manly, likely lad who owed everything to the welfare state. I'd love to be able to say at this point that this is all history, but we can see more or less the same manoeuvres being carried out over the last couple of years, with Keir Starmer outlining his working class background and seeking to embrace faith, family, faith and flag in order to win back to Labour the former red wall working class voters who have apparently embraced Brexit and Boris Johnson. Stuart Hall talked about those who were moving out of the working class due to embracing Thatcherite values such as home ownership, but from a viewpoint of identity, they haven't moved out of the working class. What has happened is that the horizon of possibility envisaged by the idea of working class politics and identity has shrunk since 1945. If we look at these responses to the 1990 Directive on Social Division, and here borrowing this from the Observing the 80s material, which is online. So this was the 1990 Spring Directive, Social Divisions. You get a description of that if you go onto that website from Dorothy Sheridan, describing another euphemistic directive called social divisions rather than class and race, open-ended to elicit responses. And I picked 3 of these out. I'm not going to say very much about these, but just to show you. So you have one person, middle class people are mean compared to working class people, and middle class people do not have the great sense of humour that the working classes have. And then you get to the last sentence at the bottom of the page. Businessmen and women are middle class and they are a very nasty lot. D156. Yes, this is, I don't say that they are high or low class, this family at the end of my street, but I choose to ignore them. A family who I will not acknowledge because they're always in trouble with the police and their garden is full of scrap metal. And then a final one I picked, I would describe myself as belonging to the group working class. And this observer says what's happened is that the way class has functioned has changed. It's based wholly nowadays on earning power. It used to be based on all sorts of things like one's family background and the schools and universities they had attended. What I think these 3 different quotes show is the kind of changing construction of working class that becomes more kind of essentialist or perhaps possibly even defensive as the kind of changes that took place across the 1980s, which in some ways reversed an earlier period from post-war Britain up to from the 50s up to the mid-70s. More or less, working class male income increased year on year. At that point, it goes into kind of reverse, and therefore you see a consequent kind of effect on how sort of class is kind of understood and portrayed, and people understandably in some cases moving back into a more kind of defensive analysis. So therefore my provisional conclusion for my British Academy project on understanding social change through autobiographical narratives, formed during the process of writing this paper, is that the reason there was a paradigmatic social change in 1939 to 1943 is because working class consciousness and identity changed. And the reason why there was paradigmatic social change in 1981 to 1984 is because working class consciousness and identity changed again. So we'll see how happy the British Academy are with that conclusion in due course. But slightly more seriously, other than just stating the obvious to some extent, How does this apply to the use, and this is my conclusion, how does this apply to the use and consideration of MO's COVID collections? I think one significant difference between this Brexit COVID time we live in and even the Thatcherite revolution of 40 years ago is that it is much more consciously seen as an opportunity for consciously triggering a paradigm shift in social values. Therefore, you know, for example, we hear in the media about the potential for a COVID reset, you know, i.e. a complete abandonment of the values that have you know, held throughout the 2010s, perhaps, you know, in a different kind of political model coming in. And following the recent Hartlepool by-election, the Tories were briefing that they expected to establish hegemony for a generation, or at least the next 10 years. People who do the kind of analysis that I do are working in think tanks and elsewhere to construct a new reality. Freedom Day, you know, might have been postponed for 4 weeks, but it's coming, and it's a powerfully seductive idea because we all want to be free of the restrictions and feel safe. I mean, I actually got my second vaccination yesterday because I want to have that protection and because I want to be able to travel and do things. There is a powerful motivation for us all to buy into the official narrative of the pandemic, to praise the NHS and the vaccine rollout. At the last of these seminars, there was a discussion of the motivation of mass observers to write for future historians. And the question is actually pretty much as Ben ended up, obviously I'm going to end up in exactly the same place saying, the question is how we then write about this COVID collections and materials, how we construct that narrative, but also not just how we construct it, how we invite those participants in mass observation to share in the process of writing that, and whether that means sending out more, you know, subsequent directives, whether that means inviting people to continue their diaries for longer. I don't know, but I think there has to be some kind of process that the pandemic cannot just stop now on Freedom Day, according to, you know, the narrative being set by the current government at the moment. And at that point, I shall stop. Thank you. Oh, there is one more page. There is a project blog, and I will put up a version of this paper in the next sort of week or so, which will have proper references and stuff in for anybody who wants to consult that. So you'll be able to find it there. Thank you very much.